Just to add a bit more to one of the examples that Raul gave, last year while I was the National Education Director at the NAACP, I had an opportunity to have a conversation with one of our local education committee chairpersons in Denver around this issue. And at that point in time last year, as we were nearing graduation, there was a particular high school, and the name of the high school in Denver escapes me now, but the concern that was raised by that education committee chairperson in Denver and her entire committee was over the fact that in that particular high school there were only 3 black male graduates for that year. And that is unfortunately fairly symptomatic of what we're seeing around the country. And so I just really wanted to echo Raul's point that in spite of Brown, despite Brown's wonderful intentions and its many great accomplishments, we still have, unfortunately, still a far way to go. Before we move into our Q&A session, I just wanted to let you know, Gary, we're going to send that blue ribbon over to you. Make sure you get that. But I wanted to take an opportunity in all seriousness. I wanted to take the liberty as moderator just to ask our panelists a couple of questions to get us started. And then what I'd like to do is to invite all of you to ask a question. I see we don't have, nor do I think we actually need a microphone this morning for questions. But what I would ask you to do, if you do have a question when we get to that, or I'm wrong, I see we do have a microphone. Okay. So what I'd ask you to do when we get to that point is if you would walk to the microphone in the back of the room next to the gentleman with the camera and just give us your name and your affiliation and then ask your question. And if you could keep your question a question and keep it brief, we'll be able to make sure we get as many people in as possible. I also want to introduce to you just at least 2 of my colleagues in the Campaign for High School Equity that I see who have joined us this morning. First, seated in the back of the room, yes, I'm going to put you on the spot just a tad bit, is Ms. Lillian Sparks, who is the Executive Director of the National Indian Education Association. And seated closer to the front is Ms. Sherry Newton-Dillard, who is with the National Urban League. And as more of our coalition members come in, I will introduce them. I hope I'm not missing anyone. And I see in the back Mr. David Perez, who is with the League of United Latin American Citizens, LULAC. So I want to thank you to my colleagues for joining us. The first question I wanted to ask, actually, I kind of wanted to go back to something you alluded to, Raul, and I'm hoping you may be able to add to this somewhat, both Joe and Gary. What kind of comments or concerns are you hearing, or have you heard, or voices from affiliates or folks at the local level about this phenomenon of students being pushed out? And the reason why I asked the question is it relates to graduation rate accountability simply in these terms. In many localities we find situations where students are being pushed out because they are the students who may not score highly on various kinds of assessments, and when those students are pushed out, sometimes institutions may have creative ways of reporting whether or not those young people are in fact graduates or not. So I wonder if the panelists might share with us anything that they have heard or are hearing at the local level around this phenomenon.
Sure, I can just add a little bit on that. We know that under NCLB there is some, albeit weak, graduation rate accountability, meaning that you don't have, there are different types of graduation rate calculations, and also under federal regulation, you didn't have to disaggregate your graduation rates. And so it's easy, it's under current law, it's easy to mask low graduation rates. Now the concern that was raised with NCLB and with that regulation, which allows for masking, is that we know there's going to be this pressure to increase achievement, as well as the pressure to increase graduation rates. And by not having more robust graduation rate accountability, it became kind of an escape hatch, meaning that there's this pressure and the steam of kids are going to be blown out of the pipeline before they graduate. And unfortunately, the concerns have come to fruition. We know that in New York City, there was a report by Advocates for Children and New York Immigration Coalition that showed, I think, more than 50,000 kids, many of whom were immigrants, were pushed out, meaning that they were counseled into making choices other than attending high school, including adult education programs and nothing. And we know that in other places where we have affiliates working in after-school programs and adult education programs, that attendance of young adults increased. Basically, the 17, 18, 19-year-old population was attending adult education programs with the ultimate goal of receiving a GED or some other certification that is not necessarily, it's not a high school diploma. And so we have seen that because of the loopholes in current law, that some kids are being basically disappeared from the school system, and no one's being held accountable.
Just to add a word or two to that, I agree with what Raul said. I mean, that's something the Commission didn't hear a whole lot about, interestingly. Part of that perhaps is the confusion about what graduation rates really mean. But from our perspective, we think it's important that we have accountability on both ends, that there's accountability for the substance and proficiency in attaining proficiency in what's being taught, but also accountability for graduating those kids, which is the point of the exercise at the end, that they attain that high school graduation. So from our perspective, we just feel like we need to close that loop.
Two things come to mind. One is part of the conversation in North Carolina has to do with the compulsory attendance age, which at the moment is 16, but there's a lot of interest in the General Assembly to changing that age, and they've been studying it for quite some time. And we have been in meetings where, not public meetings, private meetings, where some superintendents, and I want to mischaracterize this, a handful of superintendents will, in that conversation, raise issues like, we don't have room. If those kids stay another year, we don't have room for them. Or those kids want to leave when they're 16, and if they stay around another year or two, they're going to cause trouble for the other kids. There is a belief, and I might argue it's well-founded, that keeping kids in these traditional high schools doesn't serve them well, and that's one of the reasons why we're trying to change the high schools. So I think that there is some, there's some indication of a problem in North Carolina. The other issue that I would mention is, and I sort of alluded to this question about, if somebody leaves a traditional high school or any high school, public high school in North Carolina, and they say they're going to pursue a GED, should they count as a dropout, not count as a dropout? And I would say that if we have problems in data systems in K-12 education, they pale in comparison to the problems in adult ed and GED programs. I mean, those, in terms of accountability for individual students, they're even farther behind. And so to sort of build that kind of escape hatch into the accountability system, where we really don't know if a kid who leaves high school and says they're going to pursue a GED actually ever, earns a high school credential that way, putting aside any conversation about sort of the value of that credential and just whether they earned it or not. It's almost, in North Carolina at least, it's very, very difficult to tell whether that ever happens. And so to build that into an accountability system seems to me to be problematic.